How is everybody doing? And welcome back for another Strength Chat episode. Today, I've got a very special guest for you all. He's actually a returning guest to Strength
Mm.
Chat. He's the education manager at JPS Health and Fitness, the man, the myth, the legend that is Martin
Mhm.
Refalo. How are you doing?
I'm good, Steve. Thanks for inviting me back on. I can't wait to hopefully have a productive discussion.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks a lot for taking the time to jump on. I know obviously it's been a
Yeah,
while since we last spoke last on the podcast, but how are you? What have you been up to? What's been happening in your world?
I'm good. Since we last spoke, most of what I have been doing has involved research. I'm currently completing my PhD, so towards the tail end now, I'm due to finish in March of 2024, which is very exciting. I think the last time we spoke, I may have been going through my master's,
Yeah.
and it's amazing how fast time goes by when you're preoccupied and you have things on your plate that need to be addressed on a day-to-day basis. Over this time period, I've also continued coaching, both face to face and online. We spoke beforehand about how you coach powerlifters, Steve, and you're getting messages on the weekend before they step on the platform. And I'm in somewhat of a similar position here and there with my bodybuilding clients. So still coaching bodybuilders and aspiring competitors who want to step on the stage. And yeah, I love everything about coaching, and that's why I continue to do it even whilst I'm studying. And yeah, that's what I've been up to. And
Nice.
like I said, looking forward to finishing my studies and taking a bit of time off, because this is now, I think, my ninth year in a row of uh, university. No, I've been at university since finishing up year 12 at school. So I'm looking forward to a break.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that as well, because and obviously still being coaching, obviously doing your PhD, but I know you've presented and done
Mhm.
a couple of talks. How have you kind of balanced that with coaching, with everything else, and how have you actually found presenting?
Yeah, so presenting and educating is a large part of my role. I've been very fortunate to have been able to travel around Australia and around the world to some extent. I mean, I have presented internationally on a few occasions, and I love having the opportunity to pass on the knowledge that has taken me years really to develop. I somehow find a way to package years and years of knowledge into a presentation, and I really do enjoy delivering those presentations and simply meeting students on a face-to-face level, and trying to have what I call a bottom-up influence. So influence on people that starts from the ground up, as opposed to a top-down influence that one might obtain online on social media across thousands of individuals. But I think from the bottom up, the magnitude of influence you have on each person is much larger than it would be, on a top down level. So I enjoy that. And the truth is, I don't think I've balanced my responsibilities over the past few years. I'm not sure if you can find that perfect balance. Some aspects of my workload have had to be compromised.
Yeah,
I've had to pull back slightly on my coaching and on other responsibilities. I was teaching, for example,
right.
at Deakin University, which is where I also study, and I had to pull back on that. So the truth is, I haven't kept and or maintained a perfect balance. I've had to choose and order my priorities strategically. Right now the main priority is getting my studies completed,
Yeah,
and then from there, I do prioritize my education and my presenting, because I think that's a large part of my role that has really transcended from my just standard coaching. Right, I coached clients for many years, and now I've transcended to a point where with my colleagues at JPS, we are now able to, go on these trips and educate coaches, right? Not just clients. And so, that's obviously a priority too. And I think that's a realization that I really only came to maybe over the past year or two, the fact that something has to give and that you have to accept that and you have to adjust your expectations. And I think that that's gone a long way for me over the past 1 or 2 years.
Yeah, definitely. I think from what you've said there, and why I wanted to ask that is, there's a lot of space, a lot of plates that you spin in there, and I think from especially when you mentioned there about social media, people look and be like, oh wow, he's doing a PhD, he's coaching, he's doing all that. Whereas actually, sometimes adjusting that priority and being able to dial back on a couple of things is that kind of.
Mm-hmm.
I know it might be a little bit of a tangent now, but with the education side of things, after your PhD, when you finished everything, is that something that you want to build up more towards and more presentation? Because I know, just speaking from myself, I've gravitated more into a role of training the trainers that are coming into the new facility. Basically, the gym that I've gone over to has multiple gyms. So it's really good, training the other trainers. And don't get me wrong, I love coaching on the gym floor, but to be able to pass on the experience and knowledge that I've got to other trainers is really good. And I would like to do more of that. Is that something like a similar pathway that you would like to go down and have that balance between coaching and educating?
Yeah, no doubt. That's where I see my future heading. I do want to maintain some research capacity because I think that there is so much left to do in the research space, especially in our area. And I do have other interests that I want to develop further from a research perspective. So I don't know exactly what my role in the coming years will look like, but I know what I'm passionate about, and hopefully I can find a good combo that I feel gratified with on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's, like I say, a little bit of a tangent there, but I think obviously from starting out as a coach at the start, you just want to coach everybody, and then like what you mentioned, sometimes it gravitates and you end up falling into other roles that are still at the heart of the core values that you want to have. But the education side of things, I think sometimes it's a natural progression as you get older, but then also more experience as you develop as a coach. One thing that you said there obviously involved quite a lot of research, and that goes on to kind of the topics that we wanted to dive in today. Do you just want to give a little bit of a brief overview of the research that you've been carrying out, and the research that you've been doing?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm interested in ideas that have stood the test of time, because I think time is a great judge of the quality of an idea. And training hard to build muscle is an idea that's been around for a while. And we all intuitively know we have to train hard to build muscle, to make progress in the gym. And I think that evaluating these ideas scientifically can allow us to capitalize on them and get even more out of the idea, right? Squeeze more substance out of the idea, if you will. Now, my specific area of research over the past few years has been proximity to failure and its role in muscle hypertrophy. And this, links back to what I said earlier when I mentioned that training hard is something that we all intuitively know, but that we all intuitively know is important. But what does hard mean in the context of muscle hypertrophy? Now, proximity to failure likely plays a role. It does play a role in this concept, right? In this concept of hard training. And where I'm at with this is, well, how hard is too hard, right?
Yeah.
Even the person who thinks that they train the hardest, if they did 10 sets of 10 reps on a Bulgarian split squat to failure with triple drop sets on each set, they'd be training harder than they are now. But would that be more effective than, what they were previously doing?
Yeah.
And that's what I want to know more about. I simply want to explore the term hard a little more in the context of muscle hypertrophy. And the specific lens that I'm looking through is proximity to failure, and how we can manipulate that in our programming. And clearly there's a line we have to draw somewhere. I don't think it's a matter of just everyone should just train harder every week. I don't think that applies across all populations, right? I think there's a line we have to draw. I'm interested in knowing where that line sits, right? And how it differs from person to person, because I think there is individual variability here. And I'm trying to do this whilst acknowledging that for most people, that line probably is a little further ahead than they might think it is. So, most people probably have a little more to give in the gym. And again, this comes back to the initial idea that I described earlier that I'm trying to explore, which is simply hard training for muscle hypertrophy. And over the years, I've been honored to publish some research in this area to hopefully advance the field. I can only hope that it advances the field and helps people think more about proximity to failure, or better think about how proximity to failure can play a role in promoting muscle hypertrophy. My research isn't designed to change people's minds per se, and I don't think research should be a mind changing tool. I'm just presenting this research to, like I said, improve people's thinking so that we can better evaluate this idea that has stood the test of time, hopefully capitalize on it, and really just make better use of it. Because even though an idea has stood the test of time, I don't think that is to say we should just blindly follow it and say, well, training harder is always better. I think to blindly follow an idea like that would be to somewhat commit the sunk cost fallacy, which is the tendency to follow along with an idea just because you may be heavily invested in it, even though you might think you might know that there could be better ways to go about things. You're heavily invested in it, so you blindly follow it. I think we should evaluate these ideas scientifically and simply try to improve how we apply them in practice over time.
Yeah, I think one thing you said there, obviously, questions that have stood the test of time. It's just a case of, oh, well, this is how it's always been done, so we need to do it. And when we talk about training hard, it's a case of everyone knows that there needs to be some effort, there needs to be some intention in terms of the training. But how to measure that is quite hard, and how I kind of picture it when it comes to research, because 100%, you touched on there, just want to help coaches, trainers, have a better understanding, and ultimately that's going to allow to get better results and help, the clients. I think sometimes, research is a little bit like when the sun's coming up, and all of a sudden you can actually start seeing things a little bit more. It's just casting a little bit of light on there, so you can be like, okay, I'm not seeing that before. One thing that I kind of wanted to touch on, and you mentioned it a little bit in terms of it can differ between individuals, is training hard can be actually quite subjective. But there is a point where a lot of people can do a little bit more. Why I touch on that is every 3 months we have benchmarking week in the gym. Basically, every 3 months we're going to test maxes anywhere between a 3 to a 5 rep max. Look at their how many reps that they can do if they're not doing a 3 rep max. And 9 times out of 10, they all the members get more reps than what they did before. How can you, or what have your thoughts, and what have you found in terms of trying to standardize, how subjective that is, and try and get an idea of, how hard is hard, because I know there's reps in reserve, there's other tools that we can use. Is there anything that you found to be a little bit more accurate, or, be able to put some numbers to it and be like, okay, so this is actually, a good gauge of how hard you are training?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you bring up a good point. I think with many things we do on the gym floor, there is an element of subjectivity that is always going to cloud our judgments and perceptions about fatigue or how hard with training or our recovery. And I don't think that subjectivity is necessarily negative. I think it's something that we're never going to be able to step away from completely. And we should simply accept the role that subjectivity plays in some of the decisions we make and find a way to mitigate the chances of our own subjective perceptions influencing our decisions on the gym floor negatively, right? So that it is possible for your subjectivity to get into the way of effective training decisions, right? That is possible. But like I said, we're not going to be able to ever step away from that completely, but we should be looking to try and mitigate any negative influence. So when it comes to the specific concept of training hard, the first thing that you need to examine here is the goal of the training program itself, right? What might be hard for a program that is designed to promote muscle hypertrophy might be different for a program that is designed to promote strength development, right? And what we also have to understand here is that the term hard can mean many different things, right? A great example of this on the gym floor is perceived discomfort. So whenever we undergo any exercise activity, there is a degree of perceived discomfort that we experience, right? Discomfort is simply just an unpleasant sensation that is associated with a task that we are partaking in. And arguably, Steve, discomfort can be perceived as being hard. So it is possible to start a set on the gym floor and feel discomfort and proceed to terminate the set, thinking that you have trained hard enough, when in fact you may be, for example, many reps shy from momentary failure and not stimulating as much hypertrophy, for example, as you otherwise could have if you performed more reps. So the key point here is that perceived discomfort, despite being hard, or despite the possibility of perceived discomfort feeling hard, that may not translate, that feeling may not translate to an effective stimulus on the gym floor, because from our understanding, there is no link, for example, between perceived discomfort and the physiological stimulus that actually promotes muscle hypertrophy. And I think that's what you're alluding to, Steve, when you say that between individuals, right, this subjectivity, it can influence what we think is hard. And one of the reasons is for this claim you're making is because people perceive discomfort quite variably. And this was a finding in one of my original research studies that I conducted last year. I had people performing the bench press exercise to different proximities to failure, and the perceived discomfort ratings that individuals were giving me after performing their sets varied widely. So, we could have, for example, 10 people all perform a bench press set to momentary failure. Some of the individuals in this sample would perceive discomfort quite highly. Others would perceive discomfort to maybe a not so significant extent, maybe a negligible extent, right? And that just comes down to differences between individuals, just like people may tolerate stress differently, for example. So what I'm trying to get at here is that we have to find a way to try to monitor hard training on the gym floor, and you alluded to reps and reserve, so RIR, and that is a very common tool that people employ, that coaches employ to monitor how hard their training is. And despite being subjective, I think it can be a very useful tool. I think the beauty of the tool actually lies in its subjectivity, right? I can give, for example, my clients ownership over their training, teach them how to better use RIR, and get them to regulate the intensity of the stimulus that they're experiencing. And if I do have a client who was quite competent with using RIR, it can be very effective. So what you have to remember, Steve, is that RIR is just a tool that we have up our sleeves that we can use as coaches, but how we coach the tool is really what will determine how effective it is. And RIR gets a lot of criticisms, and some criticisms are fair, but really what people are critiquing in many cases is the way it is being coached. Because, for example, Stephen, I wouldn't give RIR prescription to someone who has never lifted a weight before, right?
Yeah.
If I did, the problem wouldn't lie in the RIR scale or the RIR prediction itself. It would lie in my coaching decision. So I think that's a really important point to get across. And, I found teaching RIR to be quite effective because it allows us to ensure that our clients are pushing sets hard enough, and, for example, aren't just terminating sets because they have performed a certain number of repetitions. So you may have noticed this on the gym floor, Stephen. Some people may terminate sets just because they've got to 10 reps, or maybe they've got to 8 reps and it's a even number, sounds pretty good, 3 sets of 8. Now, a lot of people think that RIR is used to dial training back. And yes, you can use it to dial training back if that's something you deem necessary. But you can also use it to make training harder. And that's what I use it for in most cases, because a lot of individuals will come to, JPS, for example, and they'll show me their programs and it'll say 3 sets of 8 and 3 sets of 10, 3 sets of 12. And I put them, to the test. I get them to perform, what they think is a good hard set, and they stop at 10 reps. And I teach them about RIR if I think they're advanced enough. And all of a sudden, they now are able to place proximity to failure as a resistance training variable higher up the order of importance, right? Because a lot of people may not realize explicitly the importance of proximity to failure. Like implicitly, they might know that, okay, I have to be pushing hard enough to build muscle. But explicitly, they don't realize that on the gym floor, for example, proximity to failure, if you're trying to build muscle, is probably more important than just stopping at a predetermined repetition target, right? So RIR can be used to regulate the stimulus that a client is being exposed to on the gym floor. It can teach a client to push harder. And what we have to remember here is that there is no dichotomy between an RIR-based approach and pushing to momentary failure. So these two concepts, they sit on the same side of the fence. They operate on the same scale. And to employ one approach is not to say that you can't employ the other. That would be a false dichotomy. I think when you are taking an RIR-based approach, by default, momentary failure sits on the RIR scale, and you can choose to perform sets or prescribe sets to momentary muscular failure if you deem necessary and if you think you are going to get a positive outcome from that. In some cases, though, you might think that a more positive outcome would be induced if you kept a rep or 2 or 3 in reserve, depending on the goal of the training program, as I alluded to earlier on.
Yeah. A couple of points in there. Number one, I thought that was a good explanation of actually how to use it as a tool because, um, you know, sometimes it's a case of, dialing back training, whereas I think the whole concept that we're talking about is that, to see hypertrophy is, we need to push a little bit harder. Two kind of follow up questions from that is, when we're talking about the tools used in terms of how to implement these strategies correctly, do you think it's a case of maybe misinterpretation or not enough education from a coach's point of view to be able to actually use it from there? Whether it's just a case of, no, I can use reps in reserve and be like, okay, this is what it's going to do, but not actually have a full understanding, or maybe they've not used it themselves in the training. And the other question from that is, I know I fired two at a time here, but the other thing you also mentioned about, it would be different training hard if it was a strength block or a hypertrophy block or a different focus on training. What's kind of the difference, or what have you found the difference between to actually wanting to develop strength and training to failure compared to, I know we've spoken there a lot about muscle, but, a lot of people will think, well, hang on a minute, which one am I actually focusing on? How are you going to distinguish between them both for those goals, if both of them make sense?
Yeah, regarding the first question, I'm not actually sure. I think in many cases, people may be stuck in their own ways. I think as a coach, it's important to be open to different approaches to training. And I think it's important to realize that in many cases, these approaches or these methods that we can apply as coaches, they're not binary. What I mean by this, it never has to be one or the other, right? For example, I don't have a specific method that I attach myself to as a coach. I speak a lot about RIR and its application, but I don't use RIR with all of my clients. I use it with the ones that I think will benefit from it. And this goes for other programming related variables that may come up in the discussion. I don't apply a one size fits all approach. I think one of the only ways you can truly appreciate the importance of what I'm describing here, despite it sounding like common sense, we all hear that there is no one size fits all diet, and that the diet that best suits you is the one that you can adhere to the most. It sounds like common sense, and you hear that a lot about cookie cutter training programs, right? You shouldn't follow a cookie cutter training program. I think most people have heard that before, but the only way you can truly appreciate its importance is if you're on the gym floor on a day-to-day basis, working with a wide range of people, observing the individual variability and how people respond, right, on multiple different levels. I'm not just talking about a physical response. I'm talking about a affective response, which encompasses your psychology, right, your mental state, all of these things. And that truly, I think, opens you up to a new level of understanding when it comes to programming and the importance of individualizing programs and not making concrete statements or blanket statements that seemingly are optimized for anyone who ever steps foot in the gym. So I think that tackles the first question. And in regards to the second one, where we're now speaking about how we can use RIR or use our understanding of hard training and apply it across different goals on the gym floor. As a coach, this is where I think you need to have a framework in place that allows you to zoom out and understand exactly why you are prescribing certain strategies. So at the end of the day, Stephen, whenever you write up a program for a client and you hand it out to them, you are handing out a method, right? It's a method. Now, there are many different methods that can work, like I alluded to earlier, and you don't need to give everyone the same method. In fact, you shouldn't, as I just described. In some cases, methods might look similar across individuals, but they probably should vary to some extent. If a method is to be effective in the long term, I think it needs to be based on some principles, right? It needs to have a first principles perspective, and the principles need to be grounded in our understanding of how things work, in our understanding of human physiology, for example. So when you're looking at differences between strength and hypertrophy or any other goal that you're trying to accomplish on the gym floor, you need to step away, I think, as if you're a coach and even just a trainee trying to figure things out on your own, step away from thinking about methods and take a few steps back, right? So what do we know about muscle hypertrophy or about strength development from a physiological perspective that can inform a set of principles that we can use to actually create a method that is going to be effective for our particular client? So an example of this is for strength development, for example, proximity to failure doesn't seem to play as much of a role as it does for muscle hypertrophy. So physiologically, if we try to base our understanding on how things work, strength seems to be influenced largely by neural adaptations, right? So there are neurological pathways that can be stimulated via resistance training that can improve one's strength independent of morphological changes, right? Changes to actual muscle size. So it seems, for example, right? So based on that physiological understanding, Stephen, the next step would be to form a set of principles that we can use to devise a method. And a principle that I would use to guide my programming if I was working with someone who wants to build strength would be, for example, the importance of load when trying to promote strength development, right? So I published a meta-analysis in 2021 looking at the influence of load on muscle hypertrophy and strength. And I found that for hypertrophy, the load that you lift, the relative load, doesn't seem to have as much of an influence on hypertrophy as it does for strength. So hypertrophy seems to be load independent to some extent, right? When we're looking at strength gains, high loads seem to promote more strength gain or strength development than low loads, likely because when you're lifting a high load, there is a larger degree of neural drive required to move that load, a higher amount of force production, etc. All these things seem to be conducive to furthering your strength. So that's a principle, for example. The importance of using a high load is a principle that would be founded on our understanding of physiology. And then we might ask the question of, well, if we're trying to get strong, well, how strong do we actually want to get? And on what are we talking about here? Do we want to be strong at a 1 rep max? Or do we want to be strong at a 5 rep max? Now, for the sake of this discussion, let's think of strength as being a 1 rep max, right? How much load can you lift for 1 rep? If that's the case, based on our understanding of principles here, our understanding of specificity, right? The load that we need to be lifting in training needs to closely resemble the goal that we're trying to accomplish. So if we're trying to maximize our 1 rep max strength, we should be lifting a load that is pretty close to our 1 rep max. And that's when the method comes into play. Now I can actually open up a Google spreadsheet and write up a training program that I think is going to allow my client to improve their strength, right? Their 1 rep max strength on a given exercise. And my thought process and my logic is actually grounded in something that I can explain just like I did then, right? So, it is possible for someone to come to that conclusion, right? It's possible for someone to say, for example, that you need to lift heavy to gain strength. But if their thought process and their logic is flawed, despite how accurate the claim is, I think we should be skeptical about the claim itself because of the faulty thought process, right? Because if there are faults in that thought process, in that logic, what are this person's future claims going to look like, right? Eventually, those logical faults, right, are going to catch up to them, and there may be inaccuracies in the claims that they make in the future. So what I'm saying is, just because one might say that you got to lift heavy to build strength, I think it's important to dive a bit deeper, right, and figure out why, because then you can apply the method across a larger population or wider populations where individual variability starts to form, right? Because it isn't the case that everyone should be lifting heavier to get stronger, right? Yes, there is some accuracy to that claim, but it's not the case for everyone. Some people, for example, may benefit lifting a lighter load because they need to improve on their technique.
Yeah.
And this is why I think the thought process and the logic is important when trying to devise a method. And the same would go if we're speaking about muscle hypertrophy. Yes, training hard is important. Pushing sets closer to failure likely promotes more muscle hypertrophy. But is it truly accurate to say that everyone should train harder if their goal is muscle hypertrophy? Based on what we've spoken about, I don't think that is the case. And that's where the thought process of the logic, the first principles perspective, and an understanding of physiology can really elucidate your thoughts, your ideas on a topic, improve your ability to write methods, and then apply those methods across, wider populations.
Yeah, definitely. I think a couple of really good things in there, and it actually goes back to what we were talking about at the start, where common questions. You need to train hard. If you need to get stronger, you need to lift heavy. Again, what you mentioned there, why, and using the research and interpret it to be like, okay, so it's like what we said at the start, casting a little bit of light on that, so you can develop those systems from there. Kind of building on from that, obviously, a common theme is how we've spoken about interpreting the research and how to develop systems. The next thing down from that, when coaches and trainers are actually implementing programs, because they might not take it that step further, and like what you mentioned, digging a little bit deeper, I need to train hard, so they'll fire all these training methods out there and drop sets and triple drop sets and everything in there. Whereas you mentioned earlier, you had a sample of subjects, bench press to failure. That's just one method that you can use within that research, within that context, just to get some data. Do you think sometimes that, when we're looking at using the research, using these as tools, casting a little bit of light on it, that, coaches and personal trainers can sometimes think, no, I'm just going to throw everything else at that now, rather than, like what you mentioned, how do you develop that system, use those principles to create, a method that's going to be right for the population that trainer's training, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so I think in this case, where some people might go wrong is because they equate a justified true belief with the last research study or the last claim they came across. And I don't think you should do that. So, for example, on social media, it is quite common to be scrolling through your feed and to come across a hot take on a certain topic. And as a coach and as a trainee, maybe more importantly, as a trainee who isn't being guided by anyone specifically, it's very easy to take that hot take or that claim at face value and then go on to apply it almost immediately in your training with no real thought behind it. And that is what may then lead to these strategies that are supposedly making training harder, and that may be the case. I mean, it depends on your definition of hard, right? I'm trying to define hard in the context of muscle hypertrophy. And for example, I don't think gassing yourself out and training until you can't even stand on your feet is always going to be more conducive to muscle hypertrophy, right? Like I said, there's many different feelings that you may experience in the gym that may lead you to believe training is hard. But for example, being aerobically fatigued on the gym floor, like simple example, yes, that's hard, but that likely isn't going to promote muscle hypertrophy. That's just an example that has come to my head. So I think in this case, what we need to be willing to do as individuals who are consuming information online is we need to be willing to dig a bit deeper and try to use that framework that I described earlier to make programming related decisions. I think it's very common from what I observe for people to make very quick decisions that aren't necessarily warranted programming related decisions, basically overnight, just because they have seen a hot take on social media. I think as coaches, we do need to be willing to update, right, our philosophies. And as trainees, right, anyone who is in this space, we need to be willing to update our philosophies. We don't want to be individuals that, for example, always click not now when the update message pops up on our laptop screen, right? We're like clicking not now, not now, not now. I don't think you should do that. I think you need to be willing to click on update, but you need to be in control of the download speed. And these days, things download real quick, right? You click update on your computer, it's going to be updated in minutes. People see a hot take on Instagram and they update their coaching philosophy in a matter of minutes from what I've observed. And I think in the real world, we need to control the download speed. If you come across a claim that you think you should award some credence to, that you think is worth your time, don't change your coaching philosophy overnight. Don't change your training philosophy overnight. Take your time with it. Let the information digest. Look at multiple sources. Read a little further. Listen to more podcasts. And try to update your training philosophy slowly over time, right? I'm not necessarily worried about how my training philosophy is going to evolve over the next 1 or 2 or 3 months, no matter what research comes out, right? I'm mostly worried about how my training philosophy or coaching philosophy is going to hold its ground over the coming years, right? Over the next 5 to 10 years, what are things going to look like for me? And I want to use research to slowly update my philosophy, because I'm not equating a justified true belief to the last claim or the last research study I came across, right? If you do that, you may literally be changing your coaching philosophy on a month-to-month basis. And based on some discussions I've had with individuals, this seems to be somewhat the case because in exercise science, we are now developing research at quite a steady pace, which is good. And it is flooding, social media on a week-to-week basis. New research studies are coming out. And although there are positives to that, and that really is great because we're expanding our knowledge base, we do have to be careful with how fast we're updating our coaching philosophy. And sometimes, Stephen, we just have to click remind me later, right? Sometimes I'll come across a hot take on Instagram, right? I'll be like, this sounds pretty interesting, but I don't think I'm ready to make a change yet. I'm just going to click remind me later. I'll do my own further research. I'll listen to a podcast or two, and I'll keep that information in reserve. So instead of reps in reserve, you can now think information in reserve. So IIR. There's nothing wrong, right, with with coming across information on Instagram or on social media, whatever it may be, that you just keep in reserve, right? You don't have to apply information immediately. You don't have to apply research findings immediately. Research findings, for example, aren't always designed to be confirmatory, right? So some research, for example, is designed to be exploratory, right? So, there was a recent meta-analysis that came out on proximity to failure that showed taking sets closer to failure led to more muscle hypertrophy. Now, this study, which I was a part of, was actually designed to be exploratory. That was embedded in the design. And exploratory research is conducted to better understand a topic that is surrounded with uncertainties, that hasn't been investigated in a specific way before. But it's done to inform future research investigations mostly, and you can't really make claims from an exploratory research study that are concrete and that seemingly confirm the effect of a certain variable, for example, on a given outcome, like proximity to failure on muscle hypertrophy. And I think these are things that, as a researcher, I try to communicate really on a day-to-day basis, because I speak to students and coaches on a day-to-day basis, and people may ask me about certain research studies. And these are the sorts of concepts that I'm speaking about to help people improve the way they think. So I'm not really giving them the answer and telling them that this is how it has to be just because this is how I do certain things. Right? I'm trying to teach them that there's nothing wrong with slowing down and realizing that not all research findings need to be applied immediately. And in most cases, when you're scrolling through social media and you come across a hot take that is based on a research study, from what I see here and there, in many cases, those hot takes miss the forest for the trees, right? And that leads to hasty decisions here and there. And unfortunately, a lot of people do fall into that trap. Again, this is just from my observations, from the discussions that I've had over the past months, for example. And, I hope that these podcast discussions where we dive into the nuance and we don't just speak about hot takes, we actually speak about nuance and detail and uncertainties, which are really embedded in science. If you've ever spoken to a scientist, you'd know, a true scientist, you'd know that nothing is really certain, right? Like if I pick up my mobile phone and drop it, I can be pretty certain it's going to drop because of gravity. But beyond that, I usually speak in probabilistic terms because things may change, and every research study is embedded with uncertainty that has to be acknowledged. And really, to develop a coaching philosophy that is effective, especially in the long run, it takes time. And making changes on a week-to-week, month-to-month basis, I don't think is as fruitful as it may seem, despite any information you're coming across on social media.
Yeah, I think as I was nodding as you were talking there, I really liked how you explained, you're not trying to change your coaching philosophy over a couple of months. We're going to think about over years. And what was going through my head, it was be a little bit like if you've been coaching for a year and then all of a sudden, I can just train other trainers, like what we spoke about at the start. It develops over time, and how you start off at the beginning. Yes, then it might change because it's not. I think you need them hours on the gym floor, and actually that I think you touched on it there, that real world experience, and then you can have a look, see what happens with this research, see how it develops, and then be like, okay, yeah, I'm gonna use that. There's a lot more there. And actually, what I found really useful as well is, and I've had a conversation with other coaches about this, and clients, to be fair, about research. And I thought it was good how you explained that, sometimes it's going to be able to confirm something, but sometimes it's just exploring that topic and thinking, okay, have we thought about it like this? One thing that
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to touch on as we're talking about um, changing our thought processes and thinking about, okay, so change our way of thinking. Sometimes they can just be a case of right, we're going to do everything to failure and add that across the board. One thing that I wanted to touch on again when we're developing structure and principles and programming and the systems that coaches use is putting their efforts in their programming into the right area. It's not a case, is it a case of, all right, so we can take everything to there, and then all of a sudden the clients are walking out absolutely battered from the session, thinking, "Oh, this was hard training," but just putting
Mm-hmm.
it within the specific areas of knowing, when to use it and what they actually using it for, if that makes sense, in the area of a workout.
Yeah, so like I said earlier, I think proximity to failure needs to be quite high up in the order of importance, order importance of resistance training variables that you can employ to design a program. And I think we have to think, though, about how proximity to failure not only influences the effectiveness of one set, but the effectiveness of multiple sets strung together across a whole workout and over time. And again, if you take a step back and think about the framework I described earlier, where we're thinking about physiology, right, how things work, we're then thinking about principles, and then we're applying methods. To me, it makes sense that you have to zoom out and think about how you can design a program that is effective in a complete way, as opposed to just looking at the effectiveness of one given set. Because what you do, how you perform one given set, will have a subsequent effect on the remainder of your workout. For example, this is something that I speak about quite often. And this is why RIR, I think, has great practical viability. Stephen, if all you know how to do is tell people to push to failure, I think you will be quite limited in your ability to apply methods that work well over time across a wider population. And really, that to me, that's the crux of coaching in the sense of programming, right? So
Yeah.
obviously we have coaching, which is multifactorial. Programming is one of these factors that is going to influence your abilities as a coach. And you want to be able to program, I think, across a wide population. Now, there may be coaches out there who specialize in certain populations, like bodybuilders. And I think even in that case, though, there's going to be times where a bodybuilder may simply not be able to push all their sets to failure, right? And if that's all you know in regards to coaching and programming, then what do you do when that time comes about? Do you just say, train a little bit lighter this week, don't go as hard? The people who, from my observations, the people who criticize RIR as being subjective will at times instruct their clients to just not go as hard. Just take it a little bit easier this week. And I know this because I have consultations with clients on a weekly basis who tell me about their experiences in the past with other coaches and what they do. And I dive into this. Now, that sort of an instruction is in itself subjective, right? So we can't get away from subjectivity. I'm not in the business of critiquing subjectivity because I don't think we can get away from it. I think we need to accept it, find ways to mitigate it. I'd much rather design a programming tool that I can employ when I want individuals to push hard, when I want individuals to pull back, because maybe we're specializing on a certain muscle group and we need to push that muscle group hard, but pull back on others. Or maybe an individual has an injury. When someone is injured, you can still get some productive training in, and utilizing RIR can really help you do that. Because I could, for example, Steve, if you were injured or you weren't feeling that good, right? Maybe you weren't feeling that good. You've been running yourself down because you've been coaching too many powerlifting meets on the weekend. If I just tell you to take it a little bit easier this week, and you just stop all your sets at 8 reps because that's just what you think is a little bit easier this week, right? You're just going through the motions. Arguably, there's going to be a lot of sets there that simply aren't as effective as they could be, even if you're feeling a little run down. But if I tell you, instead of pushing to failure, right, I want you to actually keep just 2 reps in reserve this week. I'm giving you some specific instruction that, despite being subjective, is likely less subjective than telling you to just take it a little bit easier. That's going to allow you to get more effective training in, even if you're not feeling at your absolute best. So what I'm trying to say here, the key point is that a tool like RIR, and I'm not saying it has to be RIR, I'm just saying this is a tool that I happen to be interested in, and I happen to employ with some of my clients. Using a tool like that allows for versatile programming, right? Allows for adaptive programming. I can, if I know my clients are competent with this tool, and I think clients can be competent with this tool, I think I'm confident in saying that because I have many clients who have achieved great results using an RIR-based approach, and I've conducted research that shows certain people can be quite accurate with their RIR predictions if they've actually trained to failure in the past and they're actually conscious about their abilities and about the concept of proximity to failure in general. So with this type of a programming perspective, you can adjust the degree of the stimulus, right, across a whole session over time, even if the situation that you're presented with changes, right? If you have to realize, and again, this is something that I think you really only appreciate if you work with people on the gym floor over time. I've worked with a lot of clients. My current client base, I dare say, I don't know the exact numbers off the top of my head, but most clients I currently train are probably trained for longer than 3 years. I could probably go as far as saying longer than 4 or 5 years. I don't take on many new clients at this point in time because of priorities, like we spoke about earlier in the conversation. I coached a client this morning who I've been coaching for 7 years. I think that's probably the longest client that I've coached for. The longest I've coached a client for, sorry. And I observe changes, right, in their ability to perform and their stress tolerance and how they feel, right? And having an adaptive coaching method that I can apply across all those scenarios, I think can go a long way because it allows for continual progress. Again, providing that I think the client is capable of using that tool. Because just like any tool, if you use it for the wrong job, it's not going to work. And that's not necessarily a problem with the tool, right? It's a problem with how the tool is being used. So, I mean, those are some of my thoughts as to how you can go about programming for a client and allocating effort wisely across a training session. Like I said before, I think an RIR-based approach and momentary muscular failure, right? They operate on the same scale. So across a whole training session, I have clients keeping reps in reserve in some cases, and I have them pushing to failure in other cases, right? For me, it makes sense that a client pushes to failure for certain reasons. And in other cases, it might make sense for me to tell a client to keep 2 to 3 reps in reserve or 1 rep in reserve, right? So that's a little bit about the way I go about my coaching when I'm trying to get the most out of a client over time, because again, I'm not really concerned about how my clients perform over the coming week. I mean, yes, that's a concern, but I'm more so concerned about the coming months. Right? I have clients who undergo 30-week competition preparations for bodybuilding. Right. So from day one, I'm thinking, okay, how are we going to get the most out of the next 30 weeks? How can I design a program that is going to be viable across this time period, that is going to sustain a level of stimulus needed to get the outcomes I'm after? And how do resistance training variables influence that? Proximity to failure, by the way, is only one variable out of many that will influence the effectiveness of a session. And I think the one thing that a coach or a trainee can do that will bottleneck their long-term progress is to be hyper-focused on any one given variable, right? Yes, there's an order of importance, right? No doubt we have to have an order of importance. We have to have a hierarchy that we're abiding by when writing a program, right? Some things are more important than others. But I don't think we should ever be hyper-focused on any one given training variable, knowing that there are so many interactions between variables, right? And not just interactions between variables, but interactions between the program that those variables will end up creating and individual factors, individual biology, and individual stress tolerance, and individual psychological factors, right? I think a good coach understands that what they write on a piece of paper, right, for it to work, it needs to interact favorably with the client's individual state, right, which encompasses their biological state, right, which encompasses their psychological state, their stress tolerance, their recovery capacity, their lifestyle. And I think that that's another cornerstone aspect of coaching that needs to be given more weight than just one's understanding of a specific variable like proximity to failure, despite how important it may actually be.
Yeah, I think it's kind of come full circle from what we spoke about at the start from there in terms of, yes, that can be a tool to be used, but there's other things to take into account. And by having that the education side of things and just thinking about it of, right, okay, I can use it here, but I don't need to use it from there. And just having that, when we were speaking about the education side of things, just having coaches and trainers just understanding it a little bit more. And probably the biggest thing is, why is that happening? Just rather than those questions, just going a little bit beyond that. And then, you're going to be able to have much more, like what you mentioned there, much more effective training and be able to get the results from there. Because I think sometimes it can just be a case of regurgitating quite a lot of things, and as trainers, and everyone's going to be able to respond the same, whereas it's just keeping on top of those variables from there. So I thought that was a good explanation of that. We've chatted about quite a lot of topics and had quite a lot of tangents thrown in there as well, but the last question that I like to ask from everything that we've chatted about, and you kind of threw some words of wisdom out there already. Okay. But what would be your take home points or words of wisdom from everything that we've chatted about today?
Sure. So I think this podcast seems to be directed at coaches or people highly interested in improving their training philosophies and getting better results. I think how you think about these ideas is probably more important than what you know about them. And research itself, right? So, research is going to help us develop what we know. But research is designed in a very specific way. And researchers have very specific research questions that they design studies to try and answer. Now, in practice, if we're trying to apply research, if we're trying to apply what we know in practice, we have to realize that the questions we may be trying to answer in practice aren't the same as the research questions that the researchers were trying to answer in a given research study, right? They may not actually be the same. And research in many cases allows us to identify certain trade-offs. So Stephen, you probably know this, right? With programming and with really anything, there's no real solution to a problem, right? You come up with a proposed solution, and that just brings up another problem that you may think needs to be addressed, or you may think you will just dismiss for the meantime, right? You come up with a question you want to answer in practice, and that just promotes another question, and so on. Our job on the gym floor is to decide whether or not trade-offs need to be either accepted or rejected, because there's never going to be a solution, and
Yeah.
that's there are no solutions, that there are only trade-offs. That's a great quote by Thomas Sowell. I think that applies here, and that needs to be considered when trying to interpret research studies as coaches or individuals who are interested in evidence-based practice, right? I think the way I kind of sum it up is if you are interested in evidence-based practice, and I think a lot of the listeners of this podcast probably would be. I know you speak to a lot of guys about evidence-based practice, and you're an evidence-based practitioner yourself. I'm no more an evidence-based practitioner than I am a scientific thinker, right? I try to apply the tools of scientific thinking across and throughout my life, and I specifically happen to apply those tools in my area of interest, which is coaching and fitness as well. So we have to remember that science is this broad thing that we can use to help inform decisions we make, and to help inform what we do on the gym floor. And I think there's a difference between science and research, right? So research is just a tool that we can use to improve our scientific thinking, because it's going to help us better understand certain ideas and certain topics. But it is possible to read a research finding, right, and apply it, but do so in a way that actually isn't scientific, because scientific thinking encompasses many traits, right? You have to have respect for evidence. You have to be intellectually honest. You have to be able to weigh evidence, weigh up pros and cons. You have to be willing to be non-absolute when you're making claims, because not everything is certain, right? There are so many scientific traits that can be employed without even worrying about research, right? But research is again, it's a tool that we can use if we like, but unfortunately, it seems that many people use that tool without employing the scientific traits that are really going to ensure that research tool is going to be applied effectively and widely across populations, right? So research doesn't just exist in the four walls of a lab. I mean, science doesn't exist in the four walls of a lab, right? You can use science in a lab. You can use it on the gym floor. Like I said before, I think, how you think about ideas, probably just as important, if not more important, than what you know. And I think if people can take that into the real world and just keep it in the back of their minds when they're trying to write up a program, and maybe they start questioning their decisions a little bit more, and they don't make updates to their coaching philosophy as quick as they otherwise would, I think that would improve long-term outcomes for most people. So hopefully that makes sense. And
yeah, I think from that, and a lot of things that we've spoken about there is, and you kind of summed it up there, is we want to look at the trade-off. We want to have a look at weighing up those options, because we've spoken about it before in terms of just having one method and just doing that. You touched on it a couple of times. That's a method that you use with your clients, but then you might not use it. You might not use it with others. And why I wanted to have to catch up with you and have this chat is, just to explain and have people understand and learn that it's you're always weighing things up. It's not a case of, I think the phrase of if you think you're the smartest person in the room, going to a different room. You need to always be looking at these ideas. And one thing that's been going through my head is, again, you kind of develop over time, and it's not in that. I think the analogy of like not now or remind me later. I'm a big fan of an analogy, so I enjoyed that. To think about, right, let's just think about and control the speed at what you're learning, because all these questions are being asked and this research is being carried out. It's going to be carried out over time, and changes are going to happen over time. It's a little bit like, I've actually just finished listening to on Audible Atomic Habits again. And again, things like that take time. Again, thought processes around training take time. So thanks a lot, Martin, for taking the time to jump on. Really, really enjoyed catching up with you and chatting with you today. If anyone has any questions about what we've chatted about today, see the content that you put out there, where could people find you or reach out to you?
Yeah, no problem, Steve. I think that was a great discussion. I can be found on Instagram, MR Fitness with a _. Also check out the JPS Education and JPS Health and Fitness pages. I play a role in what we do there as the education manager. So yeah, if you have any questions about any of the research I conduct or anything we spoke about today, feel free to reach out. I love, having discussions with people over, email, social media, whatever it may be. And yeah, if you have any feedback, send it through.
Awesome. Well, thanks a lot, Martin, for taking the time to jump on. Like I say, I really, really enjoyed chatting with you today. Thanks a lot to everyone listening, and I will see you all next week.
Thank you.